At 8:30 on the evening of the 23rd of March, 1882, in the private dining room of the Royal Bath Hotel, Lady Cecilia Sloane picked up her glass of claret and tipped its contents approximately 6 ounces of good Burgundy, the bottle having cost Sir Gerald Sloane's hotel account 7 shillings and 6pence, directly across the left shoulder and chest of the woman standing at the service trolley 3 feet to her right. The motion was precise and deliberate. The action of a person who has been considering the instrument available to them for several minutes, and has now located the appropriate moment for its use. The wine spread through the gray wool of the chambermaid's uniform in a widening stain, very dark in the gaslight, and reached the white cotton of the service apron and the polished floor beside the woman's left foot. Around the private dining room, which held 30 guests in the upper registers of Bath society, Lady Eugenia Ravensworth, among them, in pearl gray silk at the far table, her conversation suspended mid-syllable. The room arranged itself within 2 seconds into the particular quality of silence that forms when an action has been openly witnessed, and everyone present is in the immediate process of deciding, without appearing to decide, that they have not witnessed it. The woman at the trolley did not drop the dishes she was holding. She set them down carefully, because she had been trained in this work long enough that the prevention of breaking crockery had become a matter of professional habit, and because at this specific moment the dishes were the only aspect of the situation that remained in her control. Then she looked at Lady Cecilia Sloane. She looked at her without flinching, without lowering her eyes, and said very quietly and very clearly that the glass had been in Lady Cecilia's hand when it was tipped, and not her own. Lady Cecilia Sloane struck her across the right cheek with her open palm, hard enough to turn the woman's head sharply to the left, hard enough that the sound of it reached the far end of the room, and ended the conversation there that had not yet fallen quiet, hard enough that the woman's hand rose instinctively toward her cheekbone before she stopped it and let it fall. She stood in her wet uniform in the gaslight in a private dining room full of people who had decided not to see, and she was entirely still. No tears, no appeal to the room, no words spoken in her own defense, only the absolute, complete composure of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment for 9 days, and has spent those 9 days making certain that when it came, she would be ready for what followed it. They did not know what followed it. Not one person in that room had any understanding of what had just occurred in the space of 60 seconds. They would have understanding before the night was finished, but they did not have it yet. If you believe that a person's true worth cannot be soaked away with Burgundy wine, or struck from them by a careless hand, and that what a person genuinely is endures unchanged beneath any uniform the world has arranged for them to wear, please take a quick moment now to subscribe to our channel and leave us a comment letting us know which city or country you are watching from. Your support keeps these quiet voices of justice alive. And now, let us begin. The city of Bath, in the spring of 1882, was still the city it had been constructing itself into for 150 years, a place of regulated pleasures and carefully maintained hierarchies of assembly rooms and promenades and mineral waters, and the specific social commerce of a resort town that has been receiving the educated and well-born of England long enough to have developed its own protocols for their reception management and discreet social adjudication. The pump room still dispensed its waters to those who trusted in their efficacy and those who did not in approximately equal numbers. The Royal Crescent received its daily complement of invalids and idlers in its garden walks. The assembly rooms provided the nightly structure of the fashionable spring season concerts, whist parties, formal dinners, and the drawing rooms of the relevant 30 or 40 families provided the running commentary on who attended who, declined who was seen speaking to whom, and who was, by the quiet consensus of the season, considered to be in a position of social decline, requiring the polite distance of the entire room. The Royal Bath Hotel stood at the corner of Bridge Street, its Georgian facade 5 stories of honey-colored bathstone overlooking the river in one direction, and the city in the other. Its interiors recently improved by a change of ownership and management that had brought new wallpapers, new kitchens, and a new standard of service that the hotel's manager, Mr. Frederick Haverstock, maintained through a combination of personal attention to detail and a fierce selectivity in his hiring that required chambermaids to complete 3 months of supervised training before appearing unsupervised in a guest corridor. The hotel had established itself across 4 seasons under Haverstock's management as the most considered address in Bath for guests who required elegance without ostentation, and who valued the quality of their dinner over the grandeur of their surroundings. Gas lamps burned throughout the corridors and public rooms in bronze brackets that had been polished that morning, as they were polished every morning, and the smell of the hotel in its evening hours was of beeswax polish and roasted game, and the particular warm mineral note of the bath stone itself, which seeped through the plasterwork in cold weather. Augusta Thornwell had been making beds on the 3rd floor of this establishment for 9 days under the name Miss Mabel Price, and she had arrived at a very clear assessment of Mr. Haverstock within the first 72 hours. He was competent at his work, meticulous in his standards, generally decent in his ordinary conduct toward the staff, and possessed of the specific weakness of a man who had spent 22 years in hotel management, constructing his reputation on the goodwill of influential guests, which was to say that when the choice between what was correct and what was professionally convenient presented itself, the machinery of his decision-making had been calibrated over 2 decades to arrive at convenience without requiring him to acknowledge that a choice had been made at all. Augusta had noted this in the category of things that would become relevant before the end of the week, and had continued with the 3rd floor's 12 rooms. The Thornwell Marquisate had existed for 144 years, before Augusta's grandfather arranged its most significant feature, which was not the London townhouse in Mayfair, nor the Lincolnshire estate of 1,100 acres, nor the investment portfolio managed by the Lincoln's Inn firm of Pemberton and Sons, but the special remainder he had obtained from Parliament in 1849 at the age of 71, and at a cost in time and political effort that his daughter had described as the single most determined act of love she had witnessed one person direct at an absent stranger. The absent stranger the 4th Marquis had decided was whoever among his grandchildren would inherit the title, and he wished that person to be able to inherit it, regardless of whether they happened to be born male or female, which was not the ordinary arrangement for a British marquisate, but which was the arrangement the 4th Marquis had decided upon, and had pursued with the particular stubbornness of a very old man who is quite certain he is right about something important, and has enough years left to see it through. The 5th Marquis, Augusta's father, had been a thoughtful and methodical man, who kept his accounts in a hand. His solicitors had found over 28 years of working with them to be the most reliable they had encountered in a peerage client. He died in the summer of 1875 at the age of 57, leaving everything, the houses, the Lincolnshire farms, the investments, the title, to his eldest and only child, who was 23 years old, and who spent the first 3 months of her inheritance learning the accounts with the attention of someone who understands that Not understanding them is not an option she is prepared to accept. She had managed well. She was constitutionally suited to management, to the quiet, sustained attention to detail that the administration of a large estate requires, to the patience of working through accounts line by line until they are correct, rather than approximately correct, to the maintenance of the sort of reliable communication with agents and solicitors and farm tenants that builds over time the particular trust that makes everything run as it ought. For the first 2 years after her father's death, the Thornwell affairs had been conducted with a precision that had caused Mr. Arthur Pemberton, the senior partner at the Lincoln's Inn firm, to remark to his junior partner that the 6th Marchioness had a head for estate management that he had not encountered in her sex in 40 years of practice, which was intended as a compliment, and which she received when it was relayed to her as the moderately interesting information that Mr. Pemberton's experience of her sex in 40 years of practice had evidently been somewhat limited. Then, the winter of 1877 had arrived with a prolonged illness that began in October as a cough that would not resolve and descended by January into something serious enough that her physician, Dr. James Hartley of Wimpole Street, had told her twice on 2 separate appointments a week apart, because she had not acted on the first occasion, that her recovery required dry mountain air and a period of complete rest from correspondence, and that if she remained in London through the winter and the following spring, she was running a risk he was not willing to see her take. She had gone to Switzerland. She had been reluctant to go, and had been correct in understanding that her reluctance was practical rather than sentimental, that there were things which would happen in her absence that would not happen if she were present. She had been correct in ways she had not fully anticipated. The delegation of authority over her London financial affairs during the period of her convalescence had been arranged through a document signed before her departure, which had been a necessary and routine procedure. The person to whom the authority was delegated had been her mother's first cousin, Mr. Gerald Sloane, who had held that position for 17 years in the extended Thornwell social circle, with the careful patience of a man who understands that proximity to significant wealth, maintained with sufficient consistency and sufficient charm over a sufficient number of years, creates opportunities that more direct approaches do not. He had been attentive, useful, well-mannered, and entirely without any observable quality in any of those 17 years that would have given Augusta cause to doubt him. She had been away for 14 months. She had returned to London in the spring of 1879. She had taken up her accounts within the week of her return, because she was not a person who allowed things to wait when they required attention, and within the fortnight she had identified the first discrepancy. Within 6 weeks working through the accounts with Mr. Pemberton at her side, and the particular cold clarity that comes from understanding that you have been deceived by someone you trusted, and that you must now establish the full extent of that deception before you can act, the picture was complete. 11 forged signatures. Transfers from the Thornwell investment accounts to subsidiary agents of Gerald Sloane's own construction. A memorandum of agreement with a property agent that had been used to encumber a portion of the Lincolnshire estate with a mortgage bearing her name and not her authorization. A total of £19,841, 7 shillings and threepence, diverted from the Thornwell accounts across 14 months. The forged documents had been notarized by a Bath notary named Mr. Harrison Croft, at whose office Gerald Sloane had been resident for a portion of the previous year, and to whose establishment the relevant papers had been brought in person under the representation that they bore the genuine signature of the Marchioness of Thornwell and required only notarization. She had asked Mr. Pemberton what was required to bring the matter before the courts. He had told her the original documents examined by a qualified handwriting expert against originals of her genuine signature. Testimony from any witness who could establish that Gerald Sloane had presented himself with the authority the documents claimed, and where possible, a clear accounting of the diverted funds. The documents were at Croft's notary office in Bath. Croft's voluntary cooperation would require either Mr. Pemberton's persuasion unlikely, given Croft's evident complicity, or a court order which required evidence not yet assembled in sufficient form. She had asked whether Croft's office was open to ordinary visitors without appointment. Mr. Pemberton had said he believed so. She had arrived in Bath 11 days later, under the name Miss Mabel Price Chambermaid, employed at the Royal Bath Hotel on the 3rd floor, where Sir Gerald Sloane and Lady Cecilia Sloane had been resident in the hotel's best suite for the past 3 weeks. Lady Cecilia Sloane, formerly Miss Cecilia Crabtree of Bristol, had spent the 38 years of her life accumulating a very precise sense of what was owed to her by the world, which was a great deal, and a correspondingly precise sense of what she owed the world in return, which was nothing that inconvenienced her. She was the wife of a baronet, and had been the wife of a baronet for 14 years, and had arrived at this position from the specific starting point of a Bristol merchant family, whose money had been made in shipping contracts, and whose social position had been, before the marriage, entirely plain. The marriage to Sir Gerald had purchased her the correct form of address, and the correct kind of calling card, and the correct position in a room relative to various other people's positions she had studied with the attentiveness of a scholar, and maintained with the discipline of someone who understands that they have been purchased rather than inherited, and must therefore be perpetually defended. The anxiety that this understanding generated expressed itself in the same direction in which this type of anxiety almost always expresses itself downward toward people who could not retaliate. Hotel servants were a particular instrument. They were present in every room she occupied. They were legally and professionally constrained in their responses, and the exercise of authority over them was so entirely unquestioned in its propriety that it required no justification, no preparation, and no concealment. She rang bells late in the evening and early in the morning. She sent back meals on the grounds of errors that were not errors. She instructed chambermaids to remove and replace arrangements that had been made correctly the first time. She conducted these exercises with the ease of a person for whom they serve a function that they have never needed to examine. The chambermaid on the 3rd floor, Miss Price, a plain, quiet girl of perhaps 30, in a gray uniform that fitted her well without drawing attention, had caught Lady Cecilia's notice within the first 3 days of the Sloanes' residence, for the specific reason that she did not respond to any of the usual instruments in the usual way. She did not become flustered when instructions were changed mid-execution. She did not apologize in the excess manner that Lady Cecilia found satisfying to receive and contemptible to observe. She met corrections with a simple acknowledgment, and addressed herself to the corrected task, which ought to have been entirely satisfactory, but was in practice unsettling, because the quality of Miss Price's composure was of a kind that Lady Cecilia had not expected to find in a hotel chambermaid, and that she therefore found, without being precisely able to articulate why, an affront to a principle she considered important. She had spoken to Haverstock about her on the 4th day. She had told him that the girl's manner was impertinent, that a chambermaid who could not be made to show the appropriate contrition when corrected was a chambermaid whose presence in a guest corridor was an inconvenience to the guests paying to occupy it. Haverstock had received this observation with the professional sympathy he brought to all guest concerns involving staff had said he would address the matter, and had addressed the matter by informing Augusta that she was to adjust her manner when dealing with guests in the Sloane suite. Augusta had said she understood, and had adjusted nothing because nothing required adjusting. On the morning of the assembly dinner, Lady Cecilia had required 3 things from the 3rd floor before 10 o'clock. A window latch that was stiff. She had informed Augusta that a hotel of this quality ought to have window latches that operated correctly, and that a chambermaid who could not identify a faulty latch in her routine inspection was a chambermaid who was not performing her routine inspection, and that girls who took their wages and neglected their duties were girls who would find themselves without wages shortly enough. A towel arrangement that did not reflect Lady Cecilia's stated preference. She had instructed Augusta that the arrangement she had produced was the arrangement appropriate to a common lodging house, and not to a hotel of the Royal Bath's position, and that she would have expected even a girl from Miss Price's circumstances to have grasped the difference by the 9th day of her employment in the establishment. And a floral arrangement that had been placed 8 inches too far to the left of the fireplace mantelpiece. She had said that the flowers might as well have been arranged by someone who had never entered a drawing-room in any professional capacity, which in the case of a 3rd-floor chambermaid she supposed was not entirely surprising, though she had imagined the hotel's management might have thought to provide some basic instruction in the matter before permitting their staff to touch anything in a guest suite of this category. She had said all of this with the unhurried confidence of a woman in a room she considers entirely her own, addressing a person she considers to have no recourse beyond the apology she expects to receive. A passkey and a linen basket, she had remarked to the footman on the 2nd day of the residence, were the whole of a hotel servant's authority inside a guest suite. They established what the servant was here to do, and what she was here to avoid, which was every other thing in the room. A girl who forgot that distinction did not deserve the passkey for long. A bed can be made by anyone with 2 functional arms. Miss Price, she had said while examining the towels, the question of whether it is made correctly is the question of whether a girl in this position has the basic competence her salary implies. 6 shillings a week is not, I understand, a lavish wage, but it is a wage, and it requires in exchange a minimum standard of attention, which I should not need to be specifying at this hour of the morning, to a person of your age in a hotel of this standing. She had said this, knowing it would be heard, knowing it would cause a particular kind of pain, and finding the knowing satisfactory. Augusta had straightened the towels, moved the floral arrangement attended to the window latch, and said as she left the suite, "I apologize for any inconvenience this morning has caused you, ma'am." The 3 words, "any inconvenience," carried Lady Cecilia noted with irritation. Nothing of the cringing quality that made apologies from servants useful. They were simply information that an inconvenience was acknowledged, and that its dimensions were being left with a precision Lady Cecilia found obscurely insulting to her own assessment. Lady Cecilia found this unsatisfactory in a way she could not act on, and went to prepare for the assembly dinner with the specific edge of temper that comes from having been answered correctly, and finding the correctness itself a provocation. The private dining room of the Royal Bath Hotel was arranged for the spring season's first formal dinner at 8 o'clock, its circular tables dressed in white damask and laid with the hotel's best silver, 6 gas brackets along the walls providing warm light that caught the crystal, and the ladies' jewels and the silver serving dishes being carried from the kitchen by a procession of hotel staff in gray livery. 30 guests occupied the tables, several Bath families of 3 or 4 generations, standing a visiting general and his wife, 2 members of the judiciary, 4 members of the clergy of the senior grade and Lady Eugenia Ravensworth, who was in Bath for the month on account of her physician's advice, and who was the most socially significant person in the room, by a margin that no one present would have disputed. She was 63 years old, and had been in possession of her particular social authority for long enough that she exercised it without appearing to, which is the only form of social authority that actually works. Sir Gerald and Lady Cecilia Sloane occupied the better end of the principal table, which was a position that represented a small triumph of Gerald's social engineering, and which required a level of performance from both of them that only Lady Cecilia's expression betrayed, in the slight over-brightness of a woman who is working harder than she appears to be working. Gerald was a smooth, well-made man of 50 with silver at his temples, and the bearing of someone who has spent his life in the company of wealth, and has learned to carry himself as though he belongs to it, which he very nearly did in the borrowed sense, and which he had spent the last 3 years attempting to convert into something more permanent through the specific mechanism of £19,841 7 shillings and threepence of someone else's money. Augusta worked the service trolley near the western wall. She had requested the private dining room assignment from Mr. Haverstock's deputy that afternoon, on the grounds that the guest on table 6 had a dietary restriction noted in his file, and that she had handled this guest's specific requirements successfully on 2 previous occasions, and could do so again without requiring additional instruction. This was entirely true, and had been arranged to be true through 9 days of careful, methodical professional conduct. Haverstock's deputy had granted the assignment without particular attention. She worked steadily through the first 3 courses. She kept her eyes on the trolley and the guests she was serving, and did not look toward Sir Gerald's position at the table with any frequency or any interest, because frequency and interest were the 2 things she could not allow herself in this room on this evening. She had what she needed from 9 days of observation. Mr. Pemberton and his associates were in Bath. The court order for access to Croft's documents had been applied for at the magistrate's office 3 days ago. She was waiting. She was very good at waiting. She had been practicing it for 3 years. Lady Cecilia had noticed her within the first quarter hour of the dinner. The noticing had the quality. Lady Cecilia's noticings of Miss Price had always had the quality of finding something in the room that was not causing any particular problem, and deciding without quite being able to articulate why that the thing required addressing. She had watched the chambermaid work through the soup course and the fish course with the even attention of someone completing their work correctly, and found each quiet, precise movement an addition to the specific irritation she had been carrying since the morning. Between the fish course and the game, she had caught Augusta near the side table and said, in a voice just sufficient to be heard by the guests nearest to her, "You are standing too close to the guests' chairs when you serve. Move back." The instruction had no basis in the hotel's actual service procedures, which Augusta had studied carefully, and which specified a working distance precisely matched to the one she had been maintaining. She moved back the relevant distance and said, "Of course, ma'am." Lady Cecilia turned back to the table with the slight expression of someone who has achieved what they needed to achieve and can return to other business. The other business at the principal table was Sir Gerald's conversation with the gentleman on his left about the prospects of the Bristol and Exeter Railway, a conversation that Gerald was conducting with the smooth ease of a man who has long since learned that a confident manner in the presence of financial discussion is as valuable as any actual financial knowledge, and who has had 17 years to develop one at no personal expense. He did not look in the direction of the service trolley. He had not looked in that direction. at any point in the evening, because he had identified Miss Price on the first day of the hotel's residence, and had said nothing about it to Lady Cecilia, because saying nothing about it was the only approach available that did not require him to explain his concern, and because he had told himself, over 4 days of telling himself that a chambermaid's presence in a hotel that he and his wife happened to be staying at could not in any rational calculation mean what the most rational part of his mind was suggesting it might mean. The rational part of his mind, as it happened, was right. He did not know the rational part of his mind was right. He had not yet had occasion to find out. He was eating his game course, with the appearance of a man who is entirely comfortable in his position, which is the most reliable appearance available when comfort in one's position is not in fact what one is experiencing. When Augusta set down a dish at the table adjacent to the Sloane position, Lady Cecilia leaned slightly and said, "Your apron is creased, girl." She said it in the tone of a woman identifying an embarrassment to the establishment, not to the person. "It is visible from across the room. I cannot imagine Haverstock would be satisfied with the standard it represents." She paused, then added, "A guest corridor, a fitting room, a private dining room. None of these are places in which a girl in service can afford to be slipshod in her presentation. Slipshod dress is the beginning of slipshod work. I have found that to be invariably true." She said the last sentence to Mrs. Ravensworth beside her, as though the observation were a general truth about life, rather than a specific comment about the person 6 inches away who was hearing it. Augusta looked at the apron. It was not creased. She said, "Thank you, ma'am. I will attend to it." Lady Cecilia studied her for a moment, the composed face, the steady hands, the same unsatisfying quality of response she had been generating for 9 days, and reached for her wine-glass. The claret spread through the gray wool in the gaslight. Augusta's head came up. She stood with the soaking uniform against her skin, and the sharp smell of the wine rising in the warm room, and she looked at Lady Cecilia. She said very quietly that the glass had been in Lady Cecilia's hand when it moved, and not in her own. She said it once clearly, as the simple statement of a fact that she was recording as much as communicating. Lady Cecilia Sloane's open hand came across the right side of Augusta's face with the full force of a woman who has spent 45 minutes arriving at a specific destination and has now reached it. The sound of it silenced the room. Augusta's head turned sharply. She stood very still in the silence, with her right hand half raised toward her cheek, and then falling, and with 30 people in the gaslit private dining room of the Royal Bath Hotel deciding in unison and without discussion not to have been present for what had just occurred. Not one guest spoke. Not one chair scraped backward. Lady Eugenia Ravensworth looked at the painting above the fireplace and studied it with great care. Sir Gerald Sloane took a deliberate sip of his wine and addressed a remark about the racing season to the gentleman beside him, Mr. Haverstock, who had been standing at the service entrance, and whose presence this far into the dining room on a formal dinner evening was itself unusual, found something in the direction of the kitchen corridor to attend to, with urgent professional interest. Lady Cecilia turned back to the table. She smoothed the front of her evening gown and addressed the room in the specific tone of a woman re-establishing the temperature of the air after a minor and now resolved disturbance. She said that this sort of behavior from hotel staff was precisely the reason one spoke to management, and that she would be having a word with Mr. Haverstock before the evening was complete. Then she looked at Augusta, who was still standing at the trolley with the wet uniform, and the reddened cheek, and the expression of someone who is not here, because they have nowhere else to go, but because they have chosen to be here, and whose choice has always been of a different order than anyone in this room has yet understood. Have this girl removed from the premises, Lady Cecilia said to the footman nearest the service entrance. She is not to be present in the hotel dining room or any guest corridor. Haverstock will be informed that her dismissal is a condition of our continued residence. Augusta gathered her trolley. She did not hurry. She moved toward the service entrance with the composure of someone completing a task rather than abandoning one, and she did not look toward Sir Gerald Sloane's position at the table because she did not need to. She knew exactly where he was. She had known exactly where he was for 9 days, and she knew exactly where Mr. Pemberton was, and what the clock on the Bridge Street bell tower would read in approximately 11 minutes, and what would be arriving at the front portico of the Royal Bath Hotel at approximately that moment. She had been waiting for 9 days. She could wait 11 minutes more. The lobby of the Royal Bath Hotel was quiet at the 3/4 hour of 9 in the evening, its gas lamps burning steadily in their brackets above the main reception desk, the night clerk attending to correspondence at one end of the counter, and the hotel porter seated near the front entrance with the patient boredom of a man who has been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours and expects to sit in it for 4 more. Augusta stood near the east wall of the lobby in her wet uniform, the claret stained dark against the gray wool, her service cap still on her head, her hands folded at her waist, and waited. The long case clock in the corner of the lobby marked the minutes with its careful, indifferent tick. Through the tall glass of the hotel's front doors, the gas lamps on Bridge Street cast their orange light across the wet cobblestones of the March evening, and the river moved in the dark beyond the street. At 7 minutes past 9, a brougham carriage turned from Bridge Street and came directly to the hotel's main entrance, not the goods entrance to the rear, not the side lane, but the front portico, where the gas lights were brightest, and where the hotel's name was displayed in gilt letters above the arch. On the door panel of the brougham in black lacquer and applied gold was the device of the Thornwell Marchioness, a gold chevron above 2 crossed torches on a field of sable, surmounted by the coronet of a marquess, a device that had appeared above the library fireplace of Thornwell Hall in Lincolnshire for 144 years. 3 men stepped out. Mr. Arthur Pemberton, senior partner of Pemberton and Sons Lincoln's Inn, was 63 years old, gray-haired, wearing a good black overcoat with his watch chain visible at the waistcoat, carrying a document case. Beside him was Mr. Thomas Cruttendon, magistrate for the city of Bath, in the plain formal coat of his office. Behind them was a city constable. They entered the hotel through the front doors. The night clerk looked up. The hotel porter straightened. Mr. Pemberton looked across the lobby and found Augusta, immediately the chambermaid's uniform. The claret stain, the composure that was recognizable at 20 feet regardless of what she happened to be wearing, and walked directly to her. He stopped before her and bowed. "My Lady Thornwell," he said. The lobby of the Royal Bath Hotel went entirely still. The night clerk's pen stopped moving in mid-stroke. The porter's expression completed several arrangements in rapid succession, none of which he managed to conceal. From the corridor that led toward the private dining room, 2 steps behind them, Mr. Frederick Haverstock had been approaching to intercept the unexpected visitors. He had been told by his night clerk of a carriage at the front entrance, and had come to manage the situation, as he managed all situations, and had now stopped in the corridor doorway 6 feet away, and was looking at the scene before him with the expression of a man who has made a calculation and has realized in this exact second that the calculation was very wrong. Augusta looked at Pemberton. She held his gaze for a moment with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been waiting for this word for 3 years and is now receiving it, and is choosing with great deliberateness not to allow the receiving of it to show on her face in any manner that would be visible to the room. She said, "Is the order complete?" "It is, my lady." "And the examiner's confirmation also complete?" "Croft's cooperation was obtained this afternoon. The documents have been examined. The forged signatures are confirmed by the examiner's report which the magistrate holds." The magistrate stepped forward. He addressed the constable. They proceeded through the lobby and turned toward the private dining-room corridor. Augusta reached up and removed the chambermaid's cap. She unpinned the service apron and folded it, with the even practiced attention of a woman who has been wearing one for 9 days, and folds them from developed habit, and placed it on the side table beside the lobby clock. She smoothed her hair dark, simply dressed, needing no additional arrangement. She straightened. She was still wearing the gray wool uniform with the claret stain across the shoulder and chest. She was wearing it because there was no other garment available to her in this lobby, and because it did not matter. She was in the gray uniform, and the claret stain exactly what she had always been, and the uniform had always been in every precise and legal and human sense the least significant thing about her. The bearing that was visible to the lobby of the Royal Bath Hotel when she straightened was the bearing of the 6th Marchioness of Thornwell, and it was not an addition to what was already there. It was simply what had always been there, no longer requiring concealment. She looked at Mr. Haverstock. He was still in the corridor doorway. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has served 22 years in hotel management by making certain kinds of decisions efficiently and automatically, and who is currently encountering the specific situation in which those decisions have been revealed in the span of approximately 90 seconds to have been categorically and consequentially wrong. She said, "Shall we go in?" She entered the private dining room of the Royal Bath Hotel for the second time that evening, through the main entrance, not the service door. The constable and the magistrate were already inside, standing at the Sloane table. Sir Gerald was still seated. He was seated in the particular way that people sit when they have understood what is happening and have reached the conclusion that remaining seated is the most dignified remaining option, which is also sometimes the last dignified option available. The room had not resumed its dinner. The room was looking at the table, where the magistrate was speaking to Sir Gerald in a quiet, professional voice about the nature of the warrant he held and what it required. The room was also looking at the woman who had entered through the main doors, the woman in the gray uniform with the claret stain, who was walking through the room without hurrying, without theater, without any expression on her face. That was not simply the expression of a person who knows exactly where they are going and has already arrived, in every sense that matters at the destination. Lady Cecilia Sloane's face as Augusta crossed the room went through a sequence of arrangements that might have been interesting to catalogue had Augusta been inclined to attend to them. She was not. She was attending to what she had come in to do. She stopped near the head of the table. She spoke in the direction of the room, rather than of any single person in it, in the clear, conversational, carrying voice of someone who has spoken to rooms of this size before, and who does not require its attention to be specially signaled. "My name," she said, "is Augusta Thornwell, 6th Marchioness of Thornwell. I have been a chambermaid on the 3rd floor of this hotel for 9 days, under another name, for reasons connected to the proceedings now being conducted at this table, and I apologize to the hotel's guests and management for any disruption the evening has involved." She paused for 1 second. She did not pause for effect. She paused because the next thing required a single breath before it was said. Sir Gerald Sloane is being arrested this evening on charges of forgery and fraud pertaining to the falsification of my signature on 11 documents between the 14th of November 1877 and the 2nd of February 1879, during the period of a delegated authority I granted him before my absence abroad for reasons of health, and the diversion of funds belonging to the Thornwell estate in the total amount of £19,841, 7 shillings and threepence. The legal proceedings will continue in the appropriate venue, and I have nothing further to say about that matter tonight, Mr. Pemberton set his document case on the nearest empty table and removed 3 items from it: a bound ledger of forensic accounting, a folder of examined documents, and a handwritten statement bearing a notary's seal. He placed them with the calm precision of someone who has been preparing for this moment across 3 years and is not required to hurry through it now that it has arrived. He said, "My lady, if the room is willing to hear 3 brief statements, I believe the nature of the proceedings will be made clear." The room was willing. The room was not capable at this specific moment of being unwilling about anything. Mr. Pemberton turned and indicated a woman who had been standing near the main dining room entrance, since Augusta had entered a woman of approximately 45 in a plain, dark coat, who had come in with Pemberton and Cruttendon, and had been standing quietly near the door while the arrest proceedings occurred. She was Agnes Hooper, formerly personal maid to the Sloane household, and she had been in Bath since the previous afternoon. At Mr. Pemberton's request, she stepped forward with the composure of someone who has spent 3 years deciding whether to say what she is about to say, and has decided, and now only needs to say it. On the 19th of January, 1878, she said, speaking clearly and without excessive speed, as someone who has rehearsed a statement many times, "I was present in Sir Gerald Sloane's study at the Sloane household at 3:15 in the afternoon, when Sir Gerald signed the name Augusta Thornwell on a document I did not see the full contents of." She said it plainly, without drama. When I expressed surprise, Sir Gerald told me it was a formality, and that the authorization had already been communicated in correspondence. I accepted that explanation at the time because I did not know enough to doubt it. She paused. "I know enough now." She stepped back. The room absorbed this in the particular quality of silence it had developed for unexpected information, delivered with complete credibility. The gentleman beside Sir Gerald at the table moved his chair fractionally away from it. Mr. Haverstock appeared in the main dining room entrance at this point, which is to say that Mr. Haverstock's head appeared in the entrance, followed after a moment of visible decision by the rest of him. He had been standing in the corridor, and had now made the calculation that remaining in the corridor was no longer the professionally correct choice. He crossed the room to Augusta, and stood before her with the expression of a man who has something to say, and has decided to say it without waiting to see whether the saying of it will benefit him. He said, "Ma'am, my lady." He corrected himself without flinching. The hotel's records show that Sir Gerald Sloane presented 3 documents to our business service office during his residence, for the purpose of notarization and transmission by registered post. He said the documents were executed under the authority of the Marchioness of Thornwell. Our head clerk, he indicated a young man of perhaps 28, who had come in behind him, and was now standing near the service entrance with the expression of someone who has been keeping a secret for 3 weeks, and is glad to put it down, had doubts about the authority, claimed and retained copies of the documents, against the eventuality that the doubt proved well-founded. He cleared his throat. The doubt proved well-founded. The head clerk, whose name was Mr. James Allcroft, stepped forward and placed a folder of document copies on the table beside Pemberton's materials. He did it with the neat, concentrated attention of someone who has been a clerk for 6 years and understands that the accurate handling of paper is the specific contribution he is in a position to make to this evening, and who is making it with complete professionalism. The third statement came from the corner of the room, where a man Augusta had not noticed had been sitting in a chair near the fireplace since before she entered, not at a table, but in one of the side chairs usually occupied during the pre-dinner reception period. He was a thin man of 55 in a plain coat with the precise, careful look of a professional man who has spent his career in the meticulous work of document authentication, and who had, in this case, spent the afternoon in the office of Mr. Harrison Croft, the Bath notary, examining 11 documents under the court order that the magistrate carried. He stood and addressed the room with the flat, technical clarity of an expert witness who has delivered testimony many times and understands that clarity is the only form of persuasion that works in his specific occupation. "My name is Mr. Edward Forsyth," he said. "I am a documents examiner, engaged by the Court of Bath for the purposes of the current proceedings. This afternoon, under the authority of the magistrate's order, I examined 11 documents held at the office of Mr. Harrison Croft on Milsom Street, each bearing the name and title of the Marchioness of Thornwell in the signature position." He paused for exactly the length of time required. "Not one of the 11 signatures is genuine. All 11 are forgeries of the same hand, and that hand is not the Marchioness of Thornwell's. I have provided a written report to the magistrate, and I am prepared to present my methodology and findings in any court that requires them." He sat down. The dining room of the Royal Bath Hotel held the fact of 11 forgeries in the particular way that rooms hold facts that are at once entirely expected by the tawdry person, who arranged for them to be present and entirely unexpected by everyone else. The table from which Sir Gerald Sloane had been taken by the constable 3 minutes earlier stood with his wine-glass still at his place-setting and his napkin folded. Beside the plate and the orderliness of these objects, beside the empty chair, was the most accurate image in the room of what the proceedings had established. Augusta looked at Lady Cecilia. She looked at her with the same clear, direct attention she had given her throughout the evening, in the suite that morning, at the trolley during the dinner, in the lobby, and she addressed her for the last time as someone about whom something important and complete needed to be said. "You struck me this evening in front of 30 witnesses," she said, "for the act of stating a fact. I do not intend to pursue any separate legal remedy for that act, because the proceedings already underway are sufficient for everything that requires addressing. But I will tell you clearly and once what you struck when you did it." She let 1 second pass. "You struck the Marchioness of Thornwell in her own grey dress, in her own hotel, in her own city, while conducting her own legal business, in the company of her own solicitor, on the authority of her own court order. The dress was grey. The business was hers." She paused. Everything was hers. No tears, no raised voice, no further statement, only the absolute clarity of someone who has said the true thing and requires nothing additional from the room in which it was said. She stepped back from the table. She looked at Lady Eugenia Ravensworth, who was the only person in the room who had not in the last 15 minutes appeared to be surprised by anything at all. Lady Eugenia was watching her with the precise, contained attention of someone who has been forming assessments throughout the evening and finds them entirely confirmed, and who is now acknowledging that confirmation with the minimal gesture available to a woman of her specific social position. A single, brief, deliberate nod. Augusta returned it. She looked at Mr. Pemberton and indicated, with a slight movement of her head, that he should proceed with whatever needed proceeding with. Then she walked to the service entrance, retrieved the trolley she had left against the wall on her way out, and returned it to its correct position near the kitchen corridor, because the trolley was hotel property and deserved to be left where it belonged. She was in everything meticulous. Mr. Haverstock, who had been standing near the main dining room entrance since Augusta entered, made one attempt to speak as she passed him on her way back through the lobby. She stopped and looked at him. He said, "My lady, I know what you wish," she said. She said it without coldness, simply as information. "I know what you decided when you were standing at the service entrance this evening, and chose what you chose. You will have the opportunity to address that decision as you think best. What I will tell you is that the guests and staff of this hotel deserved better from the person responsible for ensuring they received it. Tonight, and apparently on previous occasions. Whatever you decide to do with that information is your own business." She walked through the lobby and into the night, and the Bridge Street gas lamps were still burning their orange circles on the wet cobblestones, and the river was still moving in the dark beyond the street, and the brougham was waiting at the front portico, exactly where it had stopped, its lamps burning steadily against the March evening. The legal proceedings against Sir Gerald Sloane for forgery and fraud moved through the Bath, and then the London courts with the measured, impersonal efficiency that criminal proceedings achieve when the documentary evidence is as complete as 11 notarized forgeries examined and confirmed by a court-appointed handwriting expert, supported by the testimony of 3 witnesses of unimpeachable reliability. The first witness was Mr. Harrison Croft, the Bath notary, who presented himself under the magistrate's instruction and provided a full account of the documents he had notarized, the representations under which they had been brought to him, and his own uncertainty, which he had at the time suppressed about whether the signatures were genuine. The second was Mrs. Agnes Hooper, who had been employed as personal maid to the Sloane household during the relevant period, and who had on 2 separate occasions observed Sir Gerald sign the name Augusta Thornwell on documents in the Sloane townhouse study, while representing to her when she expressed surprise that the signatures had already been provided in correspondence, and that he was simply completing the form. She had said nothing at the time because she had not understood what she was seeing. She had understood what she was seeing 3 years later, when Mr. Pemberton's clerk had found her through the servants' employment register, and she had been asked with the particular precision of someone who has thought about how to phrase a thing for a long time, whether she might be willing to set down what she had seen in writing under oath. She was willing. The third witness was Mr. Pemberton himself, who presented the forensic accounting that established with the complete arithmetical precision of a senior partner who had managed the Thornwell accounts for 31 years and could trace every pound of their income and expenditure across 4 decades, exactly where the £19,841 7 shillings and threepence had come from and exactly where it had gone. It had gone in substantial part to the purchase of number 14 Royal Crescent, Bath, which Sir Gerald Sloane had been intending to acquire as a private residence, under a name that concealed the Thornwell money behind it. The Royal Crescent property was among the assets subject to freezing order on the night of Sir Gerald's arrest, and was subsequently attached to the repayment of the fraudulent debt. Sir Gerald Sloane was convicted in the summer of 1882 and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment. His solicitor's application for a reduction of sentence on the grounds of the defendant's social position and previous good character was heard by a judge who remarked, in his rejection of the application, that the position cited in mitigation was precisely what had given the defendant the access to commit the fraud, and that a court which reduced sentences for the wealthy on the grounds of their wealth would not be a court in any meaningful sense. The remark was quoted in slightly paraphrased form in 4 London newspapers and in the Bath Chronicle. Lady Cecilia Sloane left Bath within 5 days of her husband's arrest, first to a sister's house in Gloucestershire, and then, after 3 weeks, to a furnished address in Bristol. At a careful distance from her family's origins, a distance that was not quite sufficient to make those origins invisible, but that was all the distance the situation permitted. The Bristol of 1882 was not a large enough city to make a determined disappearance fully reliable, but it was a city that had the practical decency to make the not quite disappearing a relatively quiet affair. She was not seen in Bath again. Whether she missed Bath, or whether she had come to understand that she had never quite belonged to Bath in the way she had believed herself to belong to it, was a question nobody asked her, because nobody was in a position to ask her anything directly anymore. The Royal Bath Hotel terminated the Sloane account on the morning following the arrest. This was a decision Mr. Haverstock had made before, being instructed to by the board. He had made it before 8 o'clock in the morning, in the private office behind the reception desk, in a calculation that took him approximately 4 minutes, and that he had never found it necessary to explain to anyone in detail. Bath society, which had received the Sloanes' calls and returned them across 4 spring seasons, with the ordinary social accommodation extended to a baronet's household of apparently established means, conducted the withdrawal with the specific efficiency that comes from a social procedure, performed often enough to have an established and largely unconscious method. Nothing was announced. Nothing required announcing. Individual families and individual individuals made small, quiet choices about which calls to return, about which dinners to send invitations to, about which seats at the assembly rooms were occupied by which people, and the sum of those small, quiet choices produced, within approximately 6 weeks of the arrest, a social landscape from which the Sloane connection had been cleanly removed without leaving a visible scar, because scars imply attachment, and the Belgravia and Bath social circles do not attach to mistakes. Lady Eugenia Ravensworth said nothing publicly about any of it. She was seen in April to have taken tea with the Marchioness of Thornwell in the pump room on 2 successive Tuesday mornings, which was the form of public statement available to her that required the fewest words and conveyed the most information, and which was observed by sufficient people in sufficient positions to function as a complete account of her assessment of the preceding events. Nothing further was required from her. Nothing further was said. The matter from Lady Eugenia's public position was closed, and the closing was effected with the particular economy of someone who understands that a very small, very precise action at the right moment does more work than any amount of elaboration. Mr. Haverstock remained as manager of the Royal Bath Hotel. He had not, in the technical record, dismissed Augusta from the hotel on the evening of the 23rd of March. The footman had directed her to the lobby rather than the street, which was not precisely the expulsion Lady Cecilia had requested, and which Haverstock had ensured was recorded as the fact of the evening in the hotel's own documentation. Whether this careful recording represented a decision made in the moment of pressure, or a reconstruction assembled in the hours that followed it, was a question Augusta neither asked nor considered particularly important. She had said what she had needed to say to him in the lobby, and it had been heard, and the question of what he did with it was, as she had told him, his own business. She wrote to the hotel's board of directors in the fortnight following her departure from Bath to inquire whether the establishment might consider developing a formal procedure of equal standing for two categories of complaint: guests' complaints against staff and staff complaints against guests. She noted, with the precision she brought to all correspondence, that both categories existed, that the first was currently handled with considerably greater weight than the second, and that an establishment of the Royal Bath's stated aspirations might consider whether this asymmetry reflected the standard they wished to maintain going forward. She offered to fund the legal drafting and staff training from the Thornwell estate account. The board accepted the offer in May with a letter that thanked her in terms, suggesting that they found the proposal both reasonable and, now that it had been placed before them, somewhat self-evident. The procedure was in operation at the Royal Bath Hotel by the 1st of July, 1882, and was observed in the first season of its operation to produce two formal resolutions of staff complaints against guests, both found in the staff's favor, and not one resignation from staff who had previously left such establishments without recourse. Augusta returned to Thornwell Hall in the late spring, when the elms along the avenue had come into full leaf, and the Lincolnshire light had the particular quality of early June, long, clear, and full of a warmth that Bath's enclosed streets could never quite replicate. She had been missing it, not dramatically, because she had not permitted herself to miss things dramatically during 3 years of concentrated purpose, but missing it in the constant, unacknowledged way that a person misses something that is simply part of what they are, the way you become aware of a sound only when it stops. She walked the estate perimeter in the first week in the mornings, before the farm business of the day began, and found that the Elm Avenue's stones needed relaying in the third section from the gate, and that the drainage channel along the eastern boundary had silted during the previous autumn and not been cleared. She noted both things in the estate notebook and spoke to the relevant farm manager the following day. It was ordinary work. She was glad of ordinary work. Ordinary work conducted correctly was what the last 3 years had been about. The Thornwell tenant farmers received her return with the particular warmth of people who had found the estate under a different management and had been waiting, without quite admitting they were waiting for things to return to the arrangement they trusted. She had conversations in 3 farmhouse kitchens in the first fortnight that she would think about afterward for a long time, not because anything dramatic was said in them, but because of the specific quality of the relief that was visible in the way people made tea and offered chairs, the particular loosening of the shoulders of men who had been carrying attention they had not had permission to name as such. The accounts that Mr. Pemberton's firm had maintained in her absence were correct and complete, which was what she had expected, because Mr. Pemberton's firm had maintained the Thornwell accounts for 31 years with a precision that had never required surprise. She reviewed them with the attention she gave to all accounts, and found them satisfying in the way that correctly maintained things always are not exciting, not requiring celebration, simply in order, which is the best thing an account can be. In the evenings, she sat in the library in the chair that had been her father's before it was hers, with the last of the June light coming through the south window, and the coal fire burning quietly, because June evenings in Lincolnshire require it, and she read and was at home, and allowed herself to be at home, which was the thing she had been doing without allowing herself to know. She was doing it from the moment she arrived back at the drive's gate and smelled the elm leaves and the Lincolnshire earth, and understood for the first time in 3 years that the waiting was over. On a clear June evening, seated in the Thornwell library with the Lincolnshire fields visible through the south windows in the last of the evening light, Augusta set down the account ledger she had been reviewing, and held for a moment the particular quiet that comes at the end of a long and precise piece of work. The coal fire was built correctly and burning as it should. The long case clock in the hall below ticked steadily in the manner of something that has been marking time in this house for a very long time and will continue to mark it when everyone currently present has gone on to whatever comes next. The smell of the room was coal smoke and old leather, and the faint earthy note of the Lincolnshire countryside coming through the open upper pane of the window. She thought about a wet gray uniform and the smell of spilled claret in a warm room. She thought about a hand in the gaslight and the sound that followed it. She thought about 30 people in a well-lit room making a collective decision in the space of 2 seconds about what they had seen and what they were prepared to have seen. And she thought about what that decision said about the specific world those 30 people inhabited and how they understood their own position in it. It was not a world she had been raised to inhabit from outside its gatekeeping mechanisms. She had been raised in the same world, and she understood its protocols as well as anyone in that dining room, and she understood, therefore, what the collective decision to look away actually meant. It meant that the room had assessed the woman at the trolley and determined that she was the kind of person to whom things of this nature could be done without consequence, because she had no access to the mechanisms by which consequence was produced. It was a calculation, not a moral failure. It was the operating logic of a world that had been arranged by the people who benefited from it and maintained by the people who were afraid of being removed from it. The calculation in this specific instance had been wrong. But the calculation was not usually wrong, and the 30 people in the room had no particular reason to expect it to be wrong on this occasion, and Augusta understood that, and did not hold the wrongness of the calculation against them, as though they had betrayed a principle they had never claimed to hold. What she thought about more than the 30 people in the June light in the library was Mr. Alcroft, the head clerk, who had retained copies of documents he doubted in a desk drawer against the eventuality that the doubt would matter. A young man of 28 in a job that paid, she estimated, around 35 shillings a week, with no specific protection from the consequences of what he had done, and no specific reason to have done it, except the private conviction that it should be done. He had not been asked to do it. He had not known when he did it who might eventually need what he was keeping. He had simply kept it because the documents were wrong, and someone eventually ought to know. She thought about Agnes Hooper, who had seen something she did not fully understand in a study in London in January of 1878 and had not forgotten it, and had said yes when Pemberton's clerk asked her the question 3 years later, and had come to Bath and stood in a dining room full of uncomfortable strangers, and said what she had seen in a clear voice, without requiring anything from the room in return. She thought about Mrs. Hooper's voice in the dining room and about the specific quality of its steadiness, and she was grateful for it. What they had not managed, the 30 people, the calculation, the room was that the woman at the trolley had been recording everything, not dramatically, not with any instrument other than attention and memory, and a habit developed over 3 years and 9 days of noting exactly what occurred and setting it down correctly. They had not managed that she was not there, because the gray uniform was the ceiling of what she could achieve. She was there because it was the most useful position available. There is a particular variety of cruelty that is most confident in rooms full of witnesses, because it understands that witnesses in the right social configuration are not restraints on cruelty, but its protection. The blow struck in a room full of people who will not see it is a blow protected by the same hands that did not intervene. That protection has always had a flaw, and the flaw is this: It requires the person receiving the blow to be in truth what the room believes them to be, someone without recourse, without allies outside the room, without resources the room cannot see. When that belief is wrong, the protection becomes a record. When 30 people decide not to see something, and the thing they decided not to see is the striking of a marchioness, the decision does not disappear. It only waits for the correct moment to become exactly what it always was. Pride may wear diamonds, but character wears forever. What this story has followed is not primarily a story about law or about a marquisate or about the mechanisms of criminal prosecution, though all of these played their essential part. It is a story about what a person is when the room has stripped away everything the room considers relevant: the title, the address, the correct gown, the correct entrance. A woman in a gray uniform with a claret stain down the front, standing in a hotel lobby at 9 in the evening, with a red mark across her cheek, is still exactly who she always was. The mark on her cheek was evidence. The uniform was a disguise she had chosen. The lobby was in every legal and actual sense hers to stand in. What the room had struck was itself. What did this story leave you thinking about? What do you believe is the thing that genuinely cannot be taken from a person, regardless of what the room around them decides to see? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created with the assistance of AI for entertainment purposes only. It is set against a Victorian-era backdrop for dramatic effect and does not claim historical accuracy in every detail. It does not refer to, represent, or target any real individual, family, title, or estate, living or deceased. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental